The courtroom was quiet, but the tension could be felt in the air. James sat at the plaintiff's table, his back straight but his body tense. His hands rested on the surface in front of him, fingers laced together so tightly that his knuckles turned white. He stared ahead, avoiding eye contact with anyone, especially the judge seated high above him. The room felt smaller than it actually was, the wooden walls and rows of chairs closing in on him. Every sound, the shuffle of papers, the creak of a chair, the soft whispers from the gallery, seemed amplified, making it hard for him to focus. Across the room, the defense attorney wore a smug grin, occasionally exchanging glances with the judge. The judge herself leaned back in her chair, arms crossed over her chest. She looked unimpressed, her expression one of boredom mixed with skepticism. Her eyes flicked toward James briefly, before she glanced down at the file in front of her. When she finally spoke, her tone was sharp and dismissive. "PTSD," she said, letting the word hang in the air as if it were something trivial. "It seems like everyone is claiming PTSD these days. What makes your case any different?" James flinched at her words, though he tried to hide it. His lawyer, Sarah, noticed the slight movement and gave him a reassuring nod. Sarah had been preparing for this moment for weeks, poring over documents, studying James's medical records, and rehearsing every possible scenario. She knew this hearing wouldn't be easy. Veterans' claims of PTSD were often met with doubt, not just in this courtroom but in many others across the country. People didn't always understand the invisible wounds carried by those who served. To some, PTSD was an excuse, a way to get benefits or sympathy. But Sarah had seen the toll it took on James firsthand. She'd listened to his stories late into the night, watched him struggle to hold back tears when talking about his experiences. She wasn't going to let anyone dismiss him without a fight. James shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his mind racing. He had spent countless nights rehearsing what he would say in court, but now, under the weight of the judge's judgmental gaze, the words felt stuck in his throat. He wanted to explain how his life had changed after returning home from deployment. How the simple joys he once cherished, family dinners, walks in the park, even watching television, had become unbearable. How the sound of a car backfiring could send him diving for cover, convinced he was under attack. How sleep eluded him most nights, and when it did come, it was haunted by nightmares so vivid they left him drenched in sweat and gasping for air. But none of that seemed to matter here. Not to the judge, not to the defense attorney, and certainly not to the skeptical murmurs coming from the spectators behind him. Sarah stood up slowly, her movements deliberate and calm. She adjusted her suit jacket and smoothed her hair before stepping forward to address the court. Her presence commanded attention, though she spoke softly, choosing her words carefully. "Your Honor," she began, her voice steady and respectful, "I understand there may be doubts about the legitimacy of James's claim, but I assure you, his story is far from ordinary." She paused, glancing at James for a brief moment before turning back to the judge. "Before we proceed further, may I ask one question? Just one question to clarify the depth of what my client has endured." The judge raised an eyebrow, intrigued despite herself. There was something about Sarah's confidence that made her curious. "Go ahead," she said, waving a hand dismissively. Sarah nodded and turned toward James. Her expression softened slightly as she addressed him. "James," she said gently, "can you tell us what happened the last time you heard fireworks?" For a moment, James froze. The question hit him like a punch to the gut, stirring memories he had worked so hard to suppress. His breathing quickened, and he gripped the edge of the table to steady himself. The courtroom faded away, replaced by flashes of another time and place. He saw the desert stretching endlessly before him, the sky lit up by explosions. He heard the screams of his comrades, the deafening blasts shaking the ground beneath his feet. It took every ounce of strength he had to pull himself back to the present. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "It was 4th of July, he said, his words trembling. "My family was outside watching the fireworks. I stayed inside because I knew what would happen." He stopped, swallowing hard, trying to push down the lump forming in his throat. The silence in the courtroom grew heavier. more oppressive. Everyone seemed to be holding their breath, waiting for him to continue. Sarah waited patiently, giving him the space he needed to gather his thoughts. Finally, James forced himself to go on. When the first boom went off, I dropped to the floor. I couldn't help it. My heart started racing, and I felt like I was back out there, in the middle of everything. For hours afterward, I couldn't move. All I could see were faces of men I couldn't save. His voice cracked on the last few words, and he quickly bowed his head, unwilling to let anyone see the tears welling up in his eyes. The atmosphere in the room shifted dramatically. The earlier skepticism began to dissolve, replaced by a somber realization of the pain James carried with him every day. Even the judge, who had scoffed at the mention of PTSD earlier, now sat upright, her expression thoughtful. Sarah seized the opportunity, stepping closer to the bench. "Does this sound like someone simply claiming PTSD for attention or benefits?" she asked, her tone gentle yet firm. She didn't wait for an answer, knowing the question was rhetorical. Instead, she turned back to James, encouraging him to share more. "How often does this happen? Fireworks, loud noises, unexpected sounds. How do they affect you daily?" James hesitated, unsure if he could keep going. Talking about his struggles was exhausting, and the weight of the courtroom's collective gaze was almost too much to bear, but he reminded himself why he was here. He owed it to himself, to his family, and to the countless others who suffered in silence to speak the truth. Taking a deep breath, he looked up and met Sarah's eyes. "Every single day," he admitted, his voice stronger now. "I live in constant fear. It's exhausting. I avoid crowds, public places, anything that might trigger me. My wife tries to help, but sometimes even her voice startles me. I'm not the same person I used to be." James spoke. The courtroom remained eerily silent. Even the defense attorney, who had seemed so confident earlier, now looked uneasy. Sarah watched the judge closely, noting the subtle changes in her demeanor. The initial mockery had vanished, replaced by something resembling empathy, or at least understanding. Sensing she had made progress, Sarah pressed on. "And yet, despite all this, you still sought treatment, didn't you? You wanted to get better." James nodded, his resolve strengthening. "Yes," he replied. "I went to therapy, took medication, did everything they told me. But some wounds, they don't heal easily. They stay with you." With each word James spoke, the narrative in the courtroom shifted. What had begun as a battle of skepticism versus testimony was transforming into something deeper, a recognition of the invisible scars carried by those who serve. Sarah knew they weren't out of the woods yet, but she also knew they had taken a crucial step forward. The judge's next words would determine whether justice would prevail, or whether James's story would be dismissed as just another exaggerated claim. The courtroom remained silent, the kind of silence that feels heavy and oppressive, as if the air itself is holding its breath. James's last words hung in the space between him and the judge, raw and unfiltered. His admission about seeking treatment and still struggling despite his efforts had struck a chord, though it was hard to tell exactly how deep. The judge sat motionless, her earlier dismissive attitude replaced by an unreadable expression. She stared at James, her eyes narrowing slightly as if trying to piece together the puzzle of his life. For a moment no one dared to speak. Sarah, sensing the shift in the room, took a step forward. Her movements were deliberate but calm, exuding confidence without arrogance. She glanced briefly at James, who was now staring down at his hands, his shoulders slumped. He looked drained, as if reliving those painful memories had sapped every ounce of energy from him. Sarah knew she had to keep the momentum going. "Your Honor," she said, her voice steady and clear, cutting through the thick silence. "We're not here asking for sympathy. We're here seeking acknowledgement, a recognition that our veterans carry burdens most of us can't imagine." Her words seemed to resonate, at least with some in the room. A few spectators exchanged glances, their earlier skepticism softening into something closer to understanding. Even the defense attorney, who had spent much of the hearing smirking and whispering notes to his team, now appeared less certain. Sarah turned back to James, her tone gentle but firm. "James, can you tell us more about your daily life? How does PTSD affect you outside of moments like fireworks or loud noises? What does an ordinary day look like for you?" James hesitated, unsure if he could continue. Talking about his struggles was exhausting, and the weight of the courtroom's attention felt suffocating. But he reminded himself why he was there: to fight for recognition, not just for himself but for others like him. Taking a shaky breath, he looked up and began to speak. "An ordinary day?" he repeated, his voice trembling slightly. "There's nothing ordinary about it. I wake up tired, even if I've slept. Nightmares make sure of that. Sometimes I don't want to leave the house because I know what's waiting out there. Cars honking, people shouting, kids playing with toy guns. Every little sound makes me jump." He paused, rubbing his temples as if trying to push away the memories flooding back. "When I do go out, I plan everything ahead of time. Where am I going? How long will it take? Are there places I can escape to if I need to? It's exhausting, always being on edge. And then there are the stairs. People don't understand why I flinch when someone raises their voice or why I avoid crowded areas. They think I'm weak or crazy." His voice cracked on the last word, and he quickly looked away, blinking back tears. Sarah watched him closely, her heart aching for the man sitting before her. She had seen this pain countless times in her work with veterans, but it never got easier. Turning back to the judge, she spoke again, her voice carrying both strength and compassion. "Your Honor, imagine living like that every single day. Imagine feeling trapped in your own mind, unable to escape the memories that haunt you. This isn't just about fireworks or loud noises. It's about a lifetime of trauma that doesn't disappear when someone takes off their uniform." The judge shifted in her seat, her earlier skepticism giving way to something resembling unease. She picked up her pen and jotted down a note, though no one could see what she wrote. The gesture alone signaled a change in her demeanor, however slight. Sarah pressed on, knowing she had to drive the point home. James has done everything he can to heal. He's followed doctor's orders, attended therapy sessions, taken medications. But PTSD isn't like a broken bone that mends over time. It's a wound that lingers, sometimes reopening at the slightest trigger. Would any of us laugh if we saw someone reliving their worst moments every day? The question hung in the air, directed not just at the judge, but at everyone in the room. Some of the spectators shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others nodded subtly in agreement. Even the defense attorney seemed to deflate slightly, his earlier confidence waning. Sarah stepped closer to the bench, her gaze locked on the judge. "We owe it to those who serve to listen, not to dismiss, to acknowledge their pain instead of brushing it aside. James isn't asking for special treatment. He's asking for fairness, for justice." As Sarah finished speaking, the tension in the room reached a new peak. All eyes were on the judge, waiting for her response. She sat upright now, her arms no longer crossed, her brow furrowed as she studied James, as if seeing him for the first time. Slowly, she removed her glasses and set them on the desk in front of her. Clearing her throat, she spoke, her tone markedly different from before. "Mr. James," she said, her voice softer, almost tentative. "Thank you for sharing your story. It takes courage to speak so openly about such personal struggles." The words caught James off guard. He looked up, meeting the judge's gaze for the first time since the hearing began. There was no mockery in her eyes now, only a flicker of understanding and perhaps regret for her earlier comments. The judge glanced at Sarah, then back at James. "Let the record reflect that this court acknowledges the validity of your claim. We owe it to those who serve to listen, not to dismiss." A wave of relief washed over James, though he didn't allow himself to fully process it yet. His shoulders relaxed slightly, and he exhaled deeply, the tension in his body easing ever so slightly. Sarah allowed herself a small smile, knowing they had achieved something significant. Justice, though delayed, had been served. at least for today. In the days following the trial, news of the case spread far beyond the courthouse walls. Local media picked up the story, highlighting the importance of understanding PTSD and its profound impact on veterans. Veterans organizations praised Sarah's approach, noting how a single question had dismantled prejudice and ignorance. For James, the verdict brought both relief and renewed purpose. He began volunteering at support groups, encouraging others to share their stories without shame. Though the scars of war remained, he found solace in knowing that his voice mattered, and that somewhere, someone else might find strength in his journey. Back in the courtroom, the atmosphere had transformed entirely. The earlier mockery and doubt had given way to a sense of respect and acknowledgement. As the judge adjourned the hearing, James stood slowly, his legs feeling weaker than usual. Sarah approached him, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You did great," she said softly, her voice filled with pride. "This is just the beginning." James nodded, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. For the first time in years, he felt a glimmer of hope, a belief that maybe, just maybe, things could get better. The days after the trial were a blur for James, but in a way that felt different from the chaos he was used to. For years, his life had been a storm of anxiety, fear, and constant vigilance, every moment shadowed by the memories he couldn't escape. But now, something inside him had shifted. The judge's acknowledgement of his PTSD claim wasn't just a legal victory, it was validation. It was proof that someone had listened, really listened, to what he'd been through. And while it didn't erase the pain or make his daily struggles disappear, it gave him a small sense of peace, a feeling that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't alone anymore. Sarah had warned him not to expect miracles overnight. "This is just one step," she had told him as they left the courthouse together. "You've got a long road ahead, but today proves you're stronger than you think." James had nodded, grateful for her support, but deep down he knew she was right. Winning the case didn't mean his battles were over. If anything, it reminded him how much work still lay ahead, not just for himself, but for others like him, who were fighting the same invisible war. Word of the trial spread quickly, thanks in part to Sarah's efforts to bring attention to the issue. Local news outlets picked up the story, focusing on the dramatic moment when James's testimony silenced the courtroom. Reporters described how a single question, "What happened the last time you heard fireworks?" had exposed the raw truth of PTSD, forcing even the skeptical judge to reconsider her stance. Veterans groups praised James's courage, calling him a voice for those too afraid or ashamed to speak out. Social media lit up with messages of support, many from strangers thanking James for sharing his story. At first, James found the attention overwhelming. He wasn't used to being in the spotlight, and the thought of people analyzing his life made him uneasy. But as the messages poured in, emails, letters, comments online, he began to see the bigger picture. These weren't just words of encouragement. They were lifelines thrown to others who felt trapped in their own silence. One letter in particular stood out. It was from a young veteran named Mike, who wrote about struggling to adjust to civilian life after serving overseas. "Your story gave me hope," Mike wrote. "I didn't think anyone would understand, but hearing you talk about your fears made me realize I'm not crazy. I'm not broken. Thank you." Reading those words hit James harder than he expected. For so long he had carried his pain alone, convinced that no one could truly understand what he was going through. But now, here was proof that his experience mattered, that by speaking up, he could help others feel less isolated. Slowly, he began to embrace the idea of using his story to make a difference. He started attending support group meetings not just as a participant but as a volunteer. At first, it was difficult. Sitting in a room full of strangers, each carrying their own scars, brought back memories he'd rather forget. But as he listened to their stories, he realized they all shared something in common, a desire to heal, to find meaning in their suffering. One evening, during a particularly emotional meeting, James decided to share more of his journey. The group sat in a circle, dim light casting shadows on the walls. When it was his turn to speak, James took a deep breath and began. "When I came home, I thought I could just pick up where I left off," he said, his voice steady despite the weight of his words. But everything felt wrong. The world moved too fast, too loud. People didn't understand why I avoided crowds or why I couldn't sleep. They thought I was weak. Some days I believed them. He paused, looking around the room. But then, I realized something. I wasn't weak for struggling. I was strong for surviving. And if I could survive, maybe I could help others do the same. The room fell silent. The kind of silence that comes when people are truly listening. Afterward, several members approached James, thanking him for his honesty. One woman, a former soldier named Lisa, hugged him tightly, tears streaming down her face. "You have no idea how much this means to me," she whispered. "Hearing you say it's okay to struggle, it makes me feel like I can keep going." That moment stayed with James long after the meeting ended. It reminded him why he had fought so hard to be heard, not just for himself, but for people like Lisa, who needed to know they weren't alone. As weeks turned into months, James became more involved in advocacy work. He joined forces with Sarah, who introduced him to organizations dedicated to helping veterans with PTSD. Together, they organized workshops, spoke at community events, and lobbied for better mental health resources. James discovered a passion he never knew he had, giving a voice to the voiceless. Each speech, each interview, each conversation with another veteran reinforced his belief that change was possible, if only people were willing to listen. But it wasn't always easy. There were days when the weight of his responsibilities felt crushing, when the memories threatened to pull him back into the darkness. On those days, James leaned on his support system, his wife, Sarah, and the friends he'd made through the advocacy groups. They reminded him that healing wasn't linear, that it was okay to stumble as long as he kept moving forward. And slowly, steadily, he did. One afternoon, as James prepared for a speaking engagement at a local university, he found himself reflecting on how far he'd come. Standing in front of the mirror, adjusting his tie, he barely recognized the man, staring back at him. Gone was the hollow-eyed figure who had once sat in that courtroom bracing himself for rejection. In his place was someone stronger, more resilient, someone determined to use his pain for good. As he walked onto the stage, greeted by applause from the audience, James felt a surge of gratitude. Gratitude for the journey, for the people who had stood by him, and for the chance to turn his scars into something meaningful. That night, as he drove home under a sky filled with stars, James allowed himself a rare moment of optimism. The road ahead would still be challenging, but for the first time in years he felt ready to face it. Not because the nightmares had stopped or the triggers disappeared, but because he knew he wasn't walking alone. And in that knowledge, he found strength. As time went on, James found himself growing more comfortable in his new role as an advocate for veterans. At first, it had been intimidating, standing in front of crowds, sharing parts of himself he'd spent years trying to hide. But with each speech, each story he told, he grew more confident. He realized that his words weren't just about him. They were a bridge connecting others who felt lost or misunderstood. His message was simple. You're not alone. What you're feeling is real, and it's okay to ask for help. One of the most surprising aspects of this journey was how much James learned about himself along the way. Every conversation with another veteran, every email from someone saying his story had touched their life, reminded him of his own resilience. He began to see his struggles not as weaknesses but as proof of his strength. Surviving war was one thing, but surviving its aftermath and finding purpose in the pain was something entirely different. And slowly, he started to believe that maybe he wasn't broken after all. Sarah continued to support James, often joining him at events or offering advice when he needed it. She had become more than just his lawyer. She was a friend, someone who understood the weight of what he carried and encouraged him to keep pushing forward. Together, they worked on raising awareness about PTSD, speaking at schools, community centers, and even government offices. Their goal was clear: to change the way people thought about mental health, especially for those who served their country. One evening, James received an invitation that took him by surprise. A local university wanted him to speak at their annual Veterans Day ceremony. The event would be attended by students, faculty, and members of the community, including several high-ranking military officials. It was a big opportunity, one that made James nervous, but also excited. He knew it wouldn't be easy, addressing such a large audience, many of whom might not fully understand what he'd been through. But he couldn't turn it down. This was a chance to reach people who could make a difference, to inspire change, beyond just his immediate circle. The night before the event, James sat at his kitchen table drafting notes for his speech. He didn't want to sound rehearsed or overly polished. Instead, he aimed for authenticity, hoping to convey the raw truth of his experience while leaving room for hope. As he wrote, memories flooded back, the desert sun beating down on his skin, the sound of distant explosions, the faces of men he couldn't save. For a moment, he felt overwhelmed, the familiar tightness gripping his chest. But then he remembered Lisa, Mike, and all the others who had reached out to thank him. Their voices echoed in his mind, reminding him why he was doing this. When the day of the ceremony arrived, James woke up early, his nerves buzzing like static electricity. He dressed carefully, choosing a suit that made him feel professional yet approachable. His wife helped him adjust his tie, her hands steady despite the excitement in her eyes. "You've got this," she said, giving him a reassuring smile. "Just be yourself." Her words stayed with him as he drove to the university. The streets quiet except for the occasional car passing by. The auditorium was packed when James arrived. Rows of chairs filled with eager faces. Students sat alongside older veterans, some wearing uniforms adorned with medals, others dressed casually. As James stepped onto the stage, the room fell silent, the only sound the soft hum of the microphone being adjusted. He took a deep breath, glancing out at the crowd. For a brief moment, he felt the urge to run, to retreat into the safety of anonymity. But then he spotted Sarah sitting near the front, her encouraging nod grounding him. He exhaled slowly and began to speak. "Thank you for having me here today," he started, his voice steady though tinged with emotion. "I'm not used to standing in front of so many people, especially ones I don't know. But if my story can help even one person feel less alone, then it's worth it." He paused, looking around the room. "When I came home from deployment, I thought my hardest days were behind me. I thought I could leave the war in the past and move on with my life. But I quickly learned that wasn't true. PTSD doesn't care about timelines or logic. It follows you wherever you go, shaping your world in ways you never expected." James went on to describe the challenges he faced, how simple tasks like grocery shopping became monumental hurdles, how the sound of fireworks sent him spiraling back to the battlefield. He talked about the guilt he carried, the belief that he should have done more to save his comrades. "There are nights I still wake up sweating, convinced I hear mortar shells exploding outside my window," he admitted. "And there are days when I feel like the person I used to be is gone forever." But instead of ending on a somber note, James shifted gears, focusing on the lessons he'd learned along the way. "What saved me wasn't ignoring my pain or pretending it didn't exist," he said. "It was talking about it. It was finding people who understood and letting them in. It was realizing that asking for help isn't a sign of weakness, it's a sign of strength." He smiled faintly, his gaze sweeping across the room. "To anyone here who's struggling, please know you're not alone. There are people who care, who want to help, and there's hope, even when it feels like there isn't." When James finished speaking, the room erupted into applause. People stood clapping and cheering, their faces filled with admiration and respect. Several veterans approached him afterward, shaking his hand and thanking him for putting their feelings into words. One elderly man, his uniform covered in medals, hugged James tightly, tears streaming down his face. "You spoke for all of us," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you." That night, as James lay in bed, he replayed the day's events in his mind. He thought about the connections he'd made, the lives he might have touched. He thought about the young student who had asked him how to support a family member with PTSD, and the retired officer who shared his own battle with depression. Each interaction reinforced what James had come to believe. Healing wasn't something you did alone. It was a collective effort, a shared journey. In the weeks that followed, James continued to build on the momentum from the university event. He partnered with local organizations to create workshops focused on mental health awareness, teaching participants how to recognize signs of PTSD and offer meaningful support. He also began working with schools to educate students about the realities of military service, hoping to foster understanding and empathy from an early age. Through it all, he remained grounded, remembering the importance of taking things one step at a time. One afternoon, while preparing for another speaking engagement, James received a letter that brought tears to his eyes. It was from Mike, the young veteran who had written to him months earlier. In the letter, Mike thanked James again, this time for inspiring him to seek treatment and join a support group. "Because of you, I'm learning to live again," Mike wrote. "I'll never forget what you've done for me." Holding the letter in his hands, James felt a wave of gratitude wash over him. He thought about how far he'd come since that day in the courtroom, how much his life and the lives of others had changed because he chose to speak up. He knew the road ahead would still have challenges, but for the first time in years, he felt ready to face them. Not because he had all the answers, but because he had something better, a community, a purpose, and the unwavering belief that even in the darkest moments, light could break through. As the months passed, James's advocacy work began to take on a life of its own. What had started as a personal journey to heal and find purpose evolved into something much bigger, a movement that inspired not only veterans, but also civilians, who wanted to better understand the challenges faced by those who served. People from all walks of life reached out to James, eager to learn how they could help. Some were family members of veterans, desperate for guidance on supporting their loved ones. Others were teachers, employers, or neighbors looking for ways to create safer, more compassionate environments. Each interaction reminded James of the power of connection and the ripple effect of sharing one's story. One day, while attending a community event focused on mental health awareness, James met a woman named Rachel. She was a social worker specializing in trauma therapy and had heard about his work through mutual acquaintances. Rachel approached him after his presentation, her expression warm and sincere. "I've been following what you're doing," she said, extending her hand. "It's incredible how many lives you've touched. I'd love to collaborate with you if you're open to it." James shook her hand, intrigued. Over coffee later. That week, Rachel explained her vision, a program designed specifically to address the unique needs of veterans struggling with PTSD. The idea was to combine traditional therapy methods with peer support groups, creating a holistic approach to healing. "You've already built trust within the veteran community," Rachel said. "Your voice can bring people in, and together we can give them tools to rebuild their lives." The proposal excited James, but it also made him nervous. He wasn't an expert in mental health, and the thought of taking on such a large project felt daunting. Yet deep down, he knew it was an opportunity he couldn't pass up. If this program could prevent even one person from feeling as lost as he once had, it would be worth every ounce of effort. With Sarah's encouragement and Rachel's expertise, James agreed to move forward. The planning process was intense, requiring countless meetings, research sessions, and late-night discussions. James threw himself into the work, drawing on his experiences to shape the program structure. He insisted on including practical advice, how to navigate triggers, how to communicate with loved ones, and how to seek professional help without shame. He also emphasized the importance of storytelling, believing that hearing others' journeys could provide comfort and inspiration. "When I first started talking about my struggles, I didn't realize how much it would help me," he told Rachel during one meeting. "Sharing your pain doesn't make it disappear, but it makes it lighter. That's what I want this program to do for others." After months of preparation, the pilot program launched at a local community center. The turnout exceeded expectations, with veterans of all ages filling the room. Some came alone, Others brought family members or friends. As James stood at the front, welcoming everyone, he felt a mix of excitement and responsibility. These people were trusting him, and he didn't take that lightly. "This isn't about fixing everything overnight," he began, his tone gentle yet firm. "It's about starting small, taking one step at a time toward healing. And remember, you're not doing this alone." The sessions were raw and emotional, filled with moments of vulnerability and courage. Veterans shared stories of loss, guilt, and resilience, their voices trembling but determined. Family members listened intently, asking questions and offering support. One participant, a young man named Alex, spoke about struggling to adjust to civilian life after returning from deployment. "I feel like I don't belong anywhere anymore," he admitted, tears streaming down his face. "Like I'm stuck between two worlds." His words resonated deeply with others in the room, sparking conversations about identity, belonging, and finding meaning after service. Rachel led guided discussions, teaching coping strategies and encouraging participants to practice self-compassion. She introduced mindfulness exercises, breathing techniques, and journaling prompts, all aimed at helping individuals manage their symptoms. Meanwhile, James facilitated group activities, fostering camaraderie among attendees. They laughed together, shared meals, and exchanged contact information, forming bonds that extended beyond the program itself. By the end of the 6-week session, many participants described feeling less isolated and more hopeful about the future. Word of the program's success spread quickly, attracting attention from organizations across the country. Requests poured in for James and Rachel to expand their efforts, bringing the initiative to other cities and communities. It was overwhelming at times, but James found joy in knowing that his work was making a tangible difference. He traveled frequently, delivering speeches, leading workshops, and consulting with groups interested in replicating the program. Everywhere he went, he carried the same message. Healing is possible, but it requires patience, support, and understanding. Despite his growing influence, James remained humble. He never saw himself as a hero or a savior. He was simply someone who understood the weight of carrying unseen scars. His authenticity resonated with people, earning him respect and admiration. Even strangers approached him in public places, thanking him for shining a light on issues often ignored. "You're giving us a voice," one man told him outside a grocery store. "Thank you for not letting us be forgotten." Back home, James leaned heavily on his support system. His wife continued to be his anchor, reminding him to take breaks and prioritize his own well-being. Sarah checked in regularly, offering advice and celebrating milestones alongside him. And Rachel became not just a collaborator, but a close friend, someone who shared his passion for creating change. Together, they navigated the challenges of scaling the program, ensuring that its core values, compassion, inclusivity, and empowerment, remained intact. One evening, after a particularly long day of travel, James sat on his porch watching the sun dip below the horizon. The sky glowed orange and pink, casting a soft light over the quiet neighborhood. He thought about the path he'd taken, from that courtroom where he'd felt so defeated to this moment of fulfillment. He thought about the people he'd met along the way, their courage, their resilience, their humanity. And he thought about the future, knowing there was still so much work to be done. But for now, he allowed himself to sit in gratitude. Gratitude for the lessons he'd learned, the connections he'd made, and the chance to turn his pain into purpose. As the stars began to appear one by one, James smiled softly. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but he knew this. No matter how hard the road ahead might be, he wouldn't walk it alone. And that, he realized, was enough. As the years went by, James's advocacy work grew into something far greater than he ever imagined. What had started as a personal battle for recognition had transformed into a nationwide movement, touching the lives of thousands of veterans and their families. The program he co-founded with Rachel expanded to multiple states, reaching rural towns and urban centers alike. Each new location brought fresh challenges, but also renewed hope. Veterans who once felt invisible found solace in knowing they were part of a community that understood them, a community that refused to let them fight their battles alone. James became a familiar face at conferences, summits, and fundraisers. His speeches resonated not only with veterans but also with civilians eager to bridge the gap between military and civilian life. He spoke about resilience, yes, but also about vulnerability, the importance of letting others in when the weight of the world feels unbearable. Strength isn't about carrying everything on your own, he often said. It's about asking for help when you need it. It's about trusting that you're worth saving. Despite his growing fame, James stayed grounded. He never sought accolades or awards. His motivation came from the small victories. A veteran finding steady employment after months of struggling, a family reconnecting after years of silence, a young soldier deciding to seek therapy instead of bottling up their pain. These moments fueled him, reminding him why he kept pushing forward even when exhaustion threatened to pull him under. One of the most impactful developments in James's journey was the creation of an online platform dedicated to mental health resources for veterans. The website offered articles, videos, and podcasts featuring stories from those who had walked similar paths. It included directories of therapists trained in trauma care, listings of local support groups, and forums where people could connect anonymously. For many, this digital space became a lifeline, a place to ask questions, share experiences, and find encouragement without fear of judgment. The platform also featured a section called Letters of Hope, inspired by the countless messages James had received over the years. Veterans, family members, friends, anyone touched by the invisible wounds of war, could submit letters sharing their struggles and triumphs. Some entries were raw and unfiltered, while others radiated gratitude and optimism. Together, these stories formed a tapestry of resilience, proving that no one was truly alone in their journey. One letter, in particular, stood out to James. It was written by Lisa, the woman he'd met during those early support group meetings. Her words reflected how far she'd come since they first crossed paths. When I started attending the sessions, I didn't think anything could change. I was angry, scared, and convinced my best days were behind me. But then I heard James talk about surviving, not just the war, but the aftermath. He reminded me that survival isn't just about enduring, it's about finding meaning in the mess. Today I'm working as a counselor, helping other women like me navigate PTSD. If someone had told me 5 years ago that I'd be here, I wouldn't have believed them. But here I am, proof that healing is possible. Reading Lisa's letter filled James with pride, not because she credited him, but because she represented everything he hoped to achieve. She was living proof that pain could be transformed into purpose, that scars could become symbols of strength. Stories like hers gave him fuel to keep going, even on days when the weight of his mission felt overwhelming. Of course, there were still tough days, nights when memories crept back in, uninvited and unwelcome. Days when doubt whispered that maybe he wasn't making enough of a difference. On those occasions, James leaned on his support system. His wife, Sarah, Rachel, and the network of friends he'd built over the years. They reminded him that progress wasn't measured in grand gestures but in small, steady steps. "You can't save everyone," Sarah told him during one particularly rough patch. "But you're planting seeds, and sometimes all it takes is one person hearing your story to change their entire life." And indeed, seeds were sprouting everywhere. Schools began incorporating lessons on mental health and military culture into their curriculums, thanks in part to James's efforts. Employers implemented policies to better accommodate veterans transitioning to civilian jobs. Lawmakers referenced his testimony when drafting legislation aimed at improving access to mental health care. Slowly but surely, the stigma surrounding PTSD began to fade, replaced by empathy and understanding. One autumn evening, James received an invitation that made his heart swell with emotion. A national organization dedicated to supporting veterans nominated him for a Lifetime Achievement Award. At first, he hesitated to accept, uncomfortable with the idea of being celebrated, but Sarah convinced him otherwise. "This isn't just about you," she said. "It's about recognizing the importance of the work you've done and inspiring others to join the cause. The ceremony took place in a grand hall filled with hundreds of people. Veterans, activists, politicians, and celebrities gathered to honor individuals making a difference in the lives of service members. When James's name was called, the room erupted into applause. He walked onto the stage, blinking back tears, as he scanned the crowd. There near the front sat Lisa, Mike, Rachel, and Sarah, all smiling proudly. In his acceptance speech, James kept it simple and heartfelt. "I stand here tonight not because of anything extraordinary I've done, but because of the extraordinary people I've met along the way," he said, his voice steady despite the lump in his throat. "To every veteran who has shared their story, to every family member who has stood by their side, to every civilian who has chosen to listen, you are the real heroes. This award belongs to all of us." As he stepped off the stage, overwhelmed by hugs and handshakes, James felt a profound sense of fulfillment. He thought about the courtroom where it all began, the skepticism, the laughter, the question that changed everything. He thought about the long road he'd traveled since then, the lives he'd touched and the lessons he'd learned, and he thought about the future, knowing there was still so much work to be done. That night, as he lay in bed, James allowed himself a moment of peace. He thought about the stars outside his window, infinite and unwavering, just like the human spirit. He thought about the men and women who had fought beside him, whose faces he carried in his heart. And he thought about the promise he'd made, to never stop fighting for those who needed a voice. For James, the journey would never truly end. But he didn't mind, because in giving his pain a purpose, he had found something far greater than closure. Hope. Hope that tomorrow could be brighter than today. Hope that even in the darkest moments, light could break through. And hope that, together, we could build a world where no one has to suffer in silence.